President Moon Jae-in will be making his first appearance on the multilateral stage at the upcoming G20 Summit in Hamburg, Germany. The G20, or a Group of 20, is an international forum that brings together the top leaders of 20 industrialized and emerging economies so that they can discuss the global economy and come up with coordinated solutions to a wide range of issues. So, what topics will be explored at this year's G20 Summit, and what will President Moon bring to the table? That's what we're discussing on this week's Upfront.
Less than 2 months into the job, President Moon Jae-in has begun summit diplomacy in earnest. On July 5th, President Moon held a 2-day bilateral summit with German leaders in Berlin at the invitation of German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Immediately after, he'll be attending the 12th G20 Summit in Hamburg, Germany, where he is expected to make his first appearance on the multilateral stage. The G20 Summit was created as a response to the 2008 financial crisis that began in the United States and quickly rippled across the world. It is an international forum for the heads of state and government from 20 key advanced and emerging economies to address a wide range of issues facing the international community. This year, G20 members will be discussing measures to achieve robust, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth under the theme of shaping an interconnected world. In particular, a commitment to free trade and a coordinated response to climate change are drawing keen interest amid concerns over the Trump administration's protectionism and withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and retreat from the global challenge of climate change. At this year's G20 Summit, a total of 15 agenda items will be discussed, including global economic growth, sustainable energy, refugee crisis, counterterrorism, and health issues. President Moon is expected to present his administration's core policies on job creation and green energy and join other leaders in finding a collective response to global issues. Following a successful diplomatic debut in Washington with U.S. President Donald Trump, President Moon will hold his first multilateral summit in Hamburg. On this week's Upfront, we highlight the key agendas of the G20 Summit and their implications.
For today's discussion, we are joined by two experts. Eun Mee Kim, professor in the Graduate School of International Studies at Ewha Womans University, and Kim Jae-chun, professor in the Graduate School of International Studies at Sogang University.
It's good to be here.
So one of the key agenda items at this year's G20 Summit is expected to be climate change, but we know that on June 1st, U.S. President Donald Trump pulled America out of the Paris Climate Accord. How do you think this will affect the international response to climate change?
Well, in fact, even though President Trump has decided to come out of the Paris Climate Change Accord, this was supposed to take effect in 2020, so it's going to be some years until the U.S.'s pulling out will really take effect. But what it does do is signal to the other countries that since U.S. is getting out of this, maybe we can be somewhat lenient on climate change issues and so on. So it puts a damper on the Paris Accord. So that's what concerns us.
What do you think, Professor Kim?
Well, it's going to be a big blow to the Paris Accord. But that said, I think the damage is going to be limited because if you look into the American political system, the U.S. is a federal system. That means the local governments have a great deal of leeway in matters related to climate change policies. So a lot of local governments at the state level and then also a municipal level pledged that they would abide by Paris Accords. So I think the damage is going to be limited. And also France and Germany, EU led by France and Germany would fill in the void left by the United States. And also China pledged their full-fledged commitment. So I think with or without the United States, the trend is going to be intact.
As for Korea, President Moon, since taking office, has suspended plans to build new coal-fired power plants. He also ordered the shutdown of aging power plants. So this already signifies a substantial change in Korea's climate change policies, don't you think?
I think compared to the previous government, Moon Jae-in government's policy is going to be very much environment friendly, that's for sure. I think it has a lot to do with the fine dust issue that has surfaced during the presidential election campaign period. It has become a very, very important policy issue during the presidential debates. One of the things is that President Moon is really moving forward a lot faster than I expected. Maybe it has to do with the term limit. I mean, if you are a 5-year, one-term president, you don't really have much time to lose. So instantly you become a lame duck president. I think the impression that I got is that President Moon wants to move forward as soon as he can.
Yeah, Professor Kim, what is your take on President Moon's environment policy so far?
He has been very active in the environmental issues. Even during the election campaign, he was very forward in climate change issues. Shutting down nuclear plants and so on. And these were one of the first steps that he took since he took office. So it's very evident that these are very important issues for his administration, and he's going forward. There's going to be some pushback from the business community, since this might increase the energy burden of these companies. But the general mood so far has been very good. Been very positive about his stance toward climate change and environment.
And it shows to the world how Korea is committed to the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, right?
Absolutely, and clean energy as well.
Yeah. The G20 was created on the heels of the 2008 global financial crisis to reflect the growing influence of emerging economies on the world economy. At this point, I'd like to invite Professor John Curtin for a video call. Professor Curtin is the director and co-founder of the G20 Research Group. He also teaches at the University of Toronto. Professor Curtin, what would you say is the significance of the G20 Summit? I mean, how binding are the agreements reached by the world leaders at the G20?
Since 11 summits, the one in Hamburg coming up is the 12th. But during its first 11 summits, it's made over 1,800 politically binding commitments by these powerful leaders. And they've actually been delivered at a level of about 72%. But the many commitments made at last year's summit in Asia, in Hangzhou's summit, have been delivered at an even higher rate, at least 78%. So this is just not a group of politicians gathering for a photo op or to make promises on paper. The promises they make are substantially and increasingly the promises they keep.
Now, one key area of interest will be trade and the growing tendencies of protectionism around the world. Do you think the G20 will address that this time around? And if so, what do you think U.S. President Trump's response will be?
Well, at the moment, I think by far the greatest protection that's already underway in the world is the decision of the United Kingdom to leave the largest, most integrated marketplace and free trade area in the world, the European Union. I think the major economies and trading partners of the Hamburg, they'll be able to look the British Prime Minister Theresa May in the face and say, look, if you want to leave the European Union, you may end up having an economy more like North Korea, autarkic, that nobody wants to trade with, that has no free trade with anyone else. Already, just as Britain is leaving the European Union, Canada has just signed a major free trade and economic integration deal with the European Union. And recently, even Donald Trump said he'd like to have a free trade deal for the United States with the European Union. China in that direction. Britain is going it alone down the path that we know breeds poverty in all those countries that have chosen that course. North Korea, Cuba, so many other isolationist, autarkic states. And sadly, the G20 summit in Hamburg is not going to be focusing on that. They will be focusing on President Trump's tweets and minor protectionist moves so far, and critical issues like overcapacity in the steel industry. But so far, despite all of the brave talk, most of it ill-informed about how international trade really works and about how and why the United States really needs open international trade. We've not yet seen any serious protectionist actions by the United States. And the last time President Trump went to a summit, it was the Group of Seven summit in Italy at the end of May. He did learn a lot, and he agreed with all of his G7 colleagues about the dangers of protectionism, about the value of open international trade. So there's a good chance that he'll come to that agreement here in Hamburg in the broader, more diverse G20 group.
All right. Thank you, Professor Curtin, for speaking with us today. Now, President Moon at the G20 Summit is expected to express his support for multilateral efforts to combat climate change and promote free trade, both of which U.S. President Donald Trump is not a huge fan of. This G20 Summit meeting is taking place right after the Korea-U.S. Summit, which was hailed as having been quite successful. Do you think that will be a diplomatic burden for President Moon?
Well, I don't think it's going to be too much of a diplomatic burden if you choose the wording in careful manner. I think President Moon will be delivering a speech in support of free trade and also multilateral efforts to curb climate change. But I mean, in case of climate change, it's not like Mr. Trump is opposing, multilateral efforts to fight against climate change. He's saying that this Paris Accord is not really fair to the United States.
Yes,
so
he just wants a better deal.
For President Moon to say that we should keep putting in efforts to combat climate change is not going to contradict Mr. Trump. In case of free trade, I think President Moon can say that we will be supporting trade, and that trade should be fair. You know, the free is the word. Fair is the word that Mr. Trump prefers to free. So I think, you can still deliver the message in support of multilateral efforts to combat climate change and also free trade. At the same time, you can save the face of Mr. Trump.
Yeah. Well, as mentioned earlier, we are seeing growing protectionist tendencies in international trade. Professor Curtin mentioned Brexit as being one huge example. We're also seeing some signs in France and Germany as well. What could explain this global shift towards protectionism?
It's quite ironic because the anti-globalization was really against countries like the U.S. and European Union countries that had huge, trade imbalances toward the other countries, developing countries. But now the table has shifted, and now the countries like UK and like the US are saying, well, trade is not fair for us or free for us. We're taking the burden of the other countries and we're helping them grow, but our economy is suffering. So it's really ironic that the US and the UK find themselves on the other side of the free trade argument.
On the deficit side.
On the deficit side. Yeah. But when you look at Korea-US bilateral relations, the deficit is of course on the positive on our side, but the trade deficit between the US and China is much greater. So Korea is really small in comparison to other countries. So I hope this will not escalate into a major trade war like some years back.
Do you expect these protectionist tendencies to continue for a while also?
I think it'll continue for a while unless the international community and the policy circle come up with real measures as to how we can deal with these adverse impact of economic globalization. Unlike the predictions of globalization optimists, trickle down of wealth didn't take place. Polarization of income is real, and the size of middle class is shrinking, and jobs are disappearing. This is facts. I think a policy-making circle didn't really pay enough attention to this adverse impact of economic globalization. So unless the international community and policy-making circle pay enough of attention to this adverse impact of economic globalization and come up with real measures to alleviate these adverse impact of economic globalization, I think trend toward protectionism will continue for a while.
Yeah. Well, at the multilateral level, I mean, leaders, I think, in principle agree that free trade or fair trade, as Mr. Trump would like to put it, is a good thing. But in detail, I guess each country has to look after its own interests.
When we were first discussing anti-globalization efforts when WTO was coming into place, it was really about the discrepancy and inequality between countries. So some countries were seen as to benefit tremendously from free trade, while other countries will have a major setback. But now what we're seeing is inequality is within countries. So with economic globalization, there's going to be not just winning countries and losing countries, but winner groups within countries and loser group within countries. So if in a country the loser group is becoming large and becoming very politically viable, then it's going to be a major agenda for that nation to start erecting trade barriers. So the issue has become much more complex. So unless the world is really ready to embrace the inequalities that are rising up within countries as well as between countries, this is not going to be easy, and it's not going to be, no country will face this dilemma in an easy way, because it requires a very comprehensive approach, internal, domestic, as well as international.
In the meantime, the other superpower, China, is championing free trade and globalization. Now, with the world's two largest economies, namely the U.S. and China, having such contrasting views, there are growing concerns about a possible economic war. What do you think?
Oh, I hope that doesn't come true. That's going to be a major fiasco for the whole world.
Especially for a small country like Korea.
For small countries like South Korea, who's dependent on trade. But there are enough countries at the G20 that are in support of free and fair trade. So I think we hope that it won't escalate into a major battle between the two great powers. I think it's going to be a multilateral effort, and people will stress that. So hopefully, we will have more countries on the side of free and fair trade and try to work out some of the problems, serious problems, in the current trade regime.
I think it is no secret that the two countries, the United States and China, do not really see eye to eye on many economic issues. Both countries accuse each other of trade malpractices. Particularly the United States is accusing China of manipulating currency. So there is a possibility of a big economic conflict between the two countries, but at the same time, two countries are too much economically interdependent with each other, to the extent that going to a war, I mean, if this conflict gets out of the control, some people say there is a term for this. It's MAED, mutually assured economic destruction. So I think both countries understand this mechanism and will try very hard to in order for this conflict not to spiral out of control.
Now, the G20 meeting will undoubtedly discuss coordinated action to promote free trade and strengthen the multilateral trade system. Do you think these efforts will help somehow to put a stop to the spread of protectionism?
Well, as we discussed earlier, this trade protectionism is not a simple issue. It rises from many years of economic globalization that has produced some winners within countries, but also big groups of losers, losing groups. And it's not evident that this is just due to globalization. It could be due to the problems within their domestic economy and this and that, but they're blaming it on globalization and free trade. It used to be the stories given by developing countries, but as I discussed earlier, it's now being given as a reason to go against free trade by big superpowers like the US, like the UK. So these are really worrisome signs. But as there are many other countries in the world, EU members, Korea, China, are all on the side of free trade and trying to work out some of the problems that has come up due to free trade. Let me just say that at the United Nations, Sustainable Development Goals were announced in 2015 and has come to effect in 2016. It requires all countries in the world to work together for economic, social, and environmentally friendly development. And they all agree to work together. And these are common goals that pertain to both the international agendas, but also on domestic agendas. Hopefully, the spirit of Sustainable Development Goals will be reflected also at the G20. At the G20, they do, I've seen on the agenda that Sustainable Development Goals and adherence to the goals is one of the agenda items.
In your expertise, what specifically can be done? What can these world leaders agree upon to make sure that we have sustainable development and fair distribution of wealth?
One of the major mechanisms that we use is development cooperation, providing foreign assistance to developing countries to get over some of these shocks that come from economic globalization. But this time around, Sustainable Development Goals is different from MDGs in saying that if you have problems in developed countries, you can also use the Sustainable Development Mechanism to help problems within your country. So if there's strong pockets of poverty in the US or the UK, you need to deal with that, and that's mandated by the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think using such global agreements, such as Sustainable Development Goals, the G20, will help us get over some of these major problems. It has to be done together.
Professor Kim, what would you like to see come out of the G20 meeting in terms of stopping the spread of protectionism?
Well, I think, in principle, I think it is important for G20 to highlight the importance of maintaining free trade system. I mean, despite the flaws and deficiencies in economic globalization and adverse impact of free trade, it is important to stress that there is no viable alternative to free trade. You know, protectionism cannot be a viable alternative to free trade. But at the same time, as Professor Kim Eun Mee mentioned, G20 leaders will have to use this venue as a way to discuss real measures, real policy measures to alleviate the pains of these working class people who are adversely affected by economic globalization. As to what I think sustaining development goals, international measures is important, but domestically, these individual states, the leaders will have to think about the ways in which, by using these domestic policies, so-called safety nets and so on and so forth, to think about the ways in which to alleviate the pains of these, low-income people.
Well, President Moon is certainly making the most of this opportunity to meet with world leaders. He's also holding one-on-one meetings with his Chinese, Japanese, and Russian counterparts. What do you think?
Since North Korea deployed another missile, and it looks like it could be an ICBM, they're still they have to do more investigation to confirm that this is an ICBM. This is will be a major threat, not just to South Korea and to Japan, but to China and the United States. So I think there's going to be a lot of people watching what President Xi Jinping does in his summit with the South Korean president, but with the US and Japan and other countries over this issue of the threat of North Korea's nuclear weapons. I think this is a really serious discussion, and since it happened just as the G20 leaders were getting to Germany, this may trump over other issues.
Well, climate change and free trade are key issues that could shape the future of the global economy, so it's only natural that we keep a close eye on what the world leaders have to say about them at this G20 meeting. Professor Eun Mee Kim, Professor Kim Jae-chun, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And that's all for this week. Upfront will be back next week. Thanks for watching.